the cause-effect relationships are by and large timeless. There's evolution. Evolution is how something changes over a period of time. And then around those things are these cycles, because if they're put in the same position, let's say a Federal Reserve is put into a position of having to decide, do you have defaults or do you print money? There's a choice, and that choice repeats over history. And so you can see what are the indicators of that position and what are the reactions and what are the choices. So the cause-effect relationships, by and large, remain the same through history. But there's always a reason. We're changing the world order, okay? In 1945, we started the New World Order. What I mean is, throughout history, there's a fight for control, because there's no world court that you go to and plead your case. And so there's a fight for power. So there's a war, and then the winners come out of that war, and the winners set the rules. And so 1945, the United States had 80% of the world's money. Gold was money at the time. It had half the world's GDP. It had a monopoly on military power. So the U.S. set the world order. That's why the United Nations is in New York. Washington, D.C. has the IMF and the World Bank. And its currency became the reserve currency because of that set of circumstances. Things evolve, things change over history. So the three big things that are changing now that haven't occurred in our lifetime is the amount of debt and money creation, which affects the value of money, and you could see it affecting what's going on every day. The large debt puts central bankers in a choice. Do you pay it back with hard money, or do you pay it back with printed devalued money? And if you pay it back with hard money, it's hard. In other words, that's when you have debt crises. So in all cases, they eventually print money, and that produces inflation. That's the place we are at this moment. Okay. The second is when there's a great internal conflict, usually when there's a large wealth and values gap, at the same time as you have a financial problem. Then you get populism of the left and populism of the right. In other words, those who feel disenfranchised want people who are going to fight for them. They don't want compromisers. They don't want them to be in the middle, because middle means that they're not fighting for them. They want them to have guts. So you have populists of the left, and their positions harden, and there are no compromises. That's why we're potentially in a situation that you could see in one of these elections, maybe in 2024, that neither side would accept losing. Perhaps we see that. Maybe you don't follow the rulings of the Supreme Court. Anyway, these things have not happened in our lifetime, but they happened many times in history. So if you look at that, you see from those patterns why the gaps become greater and the positions harden, and you see the dynamic. So that's the second. And the third is the rise of a great power to challenge the existing great power. In other words, I gave you the example of how the United States was so dominant in 1945. Now it's not as dominant. It is not dominant. In other words, China and the opposition is as strong as the United States and its allies. And so we have a conflict. And there are 5 kinds of wars, and they start in this order, just sequentially, typically. A trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical influence war. Then you get into a capital and economic warfare, which we are now with sanctions. They always happened in history. And then there's a military war. And so you could see that progression happen through time. I think that there's a tendency to look at the economy in a rearview mirror, seeing low levels of inflation, and also not understanding monetary inflation. There are 2 types of inflation. There's an inflation when the demand is pressing up against the ability to produce. So we had that kind of inflation. Unemployment rates go down and there's a limit to the capacity to produce. There's also a monetary inflation. And a monetary inflation means, very simply, if you produce more money in credit, if that increase is greater than the production of the goods and services, prices will go up. It creates a spiral, which we're seeing now. In other words, the selling of bonds. So it makes the imbalance become greater, because not only do you sell the bonds to pay for the deficit governments do, but holders of bonds choose to sell bonds because they're not producing a good real return. Now, that just mechanistically may be a little bit tricky for some people, but what that means is when you have a big supply-demand imbalance like that, either interest rates have got to go up to curtail that demand, or the central bank has to print more money, and they always print more money. So that dynamic of monetary inflation, the type of thing that makes the 70s, or the type of thing that makes inflationary depressions like happened in the Weimar Republic in Germany in the early 1920s, that kind of inflation I don't think is paid enough attention to. Inevitably, there's a certain amount of debt that has to be paid. And one man's debts are another man's assets. And the more debt you have, the bigger the problem is. And so when you have a lot of debt and you have to pay it back, you're either going to pay it back in hard money, or you're going to pay it back in depreciated money. And that becomes the choice of the central bank. That's why you get stagflations. That's why we have an environment like we have now. You have economic weakness. You have a stagnant economy, low growth, and with high inflation. And that happens through this monetary situation that I'm describing, in which the central bank tries to deal with a middle course. In other words, what does the central bank want? Not too high inflation and not too low growth. And so when there's a lot of debt, because one man's debts are another man's assets, it becomes very difficult, a balancing act. And that is when you have stagflation, when you produce it. So just like in the 1960s, late 60s, we spent a lot of money on guns and butter, we called it, right. The Vietnam War, social programs, and so on. We wrote too many checks relative to the money we had in the bank, which was gold at the time. 1971, the devaluation. Then they print a lot of money into that stagflation. So stagflation is the middle course when there's two different. So think about it this way. How does he literally fight inflation? Because everybody says tight money policies. And how do you fight inflation? The way that happens is you get people to spend less by taking money and credit away from them. Right. So he will reduce the amount of money and credit that's available. The Federal Reserve is going to sell $1.1 trillion of debt that it has, debt assets, bonds. Right. And then they're going to raise interest rates. So they create a squeeze that reduces demand at the same time as people don't have enough money because inflation is high. The buying power is less. And then what that act is to reduce buying power again to reduce inflation, but it comes at a big cost. And that is stagflation. I want to explain inflation in a very simple way. There's a certain amount, quantity of buying, that is of how much money and credit you're given, divided by the amount of quantity of goods and services sold. In other words, if there's a lot more money and credit produced than there is goods and services produced, you will have an inflation, and the magnitude will be a function of that ratio. Over that period of time, there was a very enormous amount of money and credit that was produced, and there were some bottlenecks and shortages of production and disruption because of mostly of a combination of COVID and also geopolitical issues. Yeah. So there was some effect. Most of the inflation came from the production. We attribute it. We can go down to actually calculate it. Most of that was due to the enormous increase in money and credit and spending that was produced. If you now look at the United States, it's no longer dominant militarily. It's no longer dominant economically because China has become comparable and is a larger trading partner with other countries than the United States is, the amount of trade and so on. It's a very unique power. Think about it. You can print the money that the world will accept. Now that means when they accept it, they buy your bonds, they buy your debt. That's what they hold these in, which are promises to receive this currency that you can print. So there are two things now that are jeopardizing that position. Dollar's now strong, but there are two things, we want to hold on to that position. Two things that threaten it. First is the printing and devaluing money, but all countries right now are doing it. So in all countries, currencies are depreciating against goods and services prices. And then the other issue, which is interesting, is the weaponization of the dollar in the form of sanctions. America is certainly in relative decline. In other words, has been. Education is not the same. Military power is not the same. Economic power is not the same. If we're